So, what if I told you there are two different characters living inside your head? Well, today, that's exactly what we're going to explore. We're diving into the work of Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman to look at the constant tug of war between your fast, intuitive mind and your slow, logical one. And trust me, this little battle, it shapes every single choice you make.
Here's a question for you. Are you really in charge of your own thoughts? I mean, it seems obvious, right? Of course you are. But what if most of what you think, feel, and do is actually happening on autopilot, guided by a hidden part of your mind you barely even notice? Let's find out who's really calling the shots in there.
All right, so here's our game plan. First up, we're going to meet the two systems running the show in your brain. Then, we'll look at the mental shortcuts they take, and how those shortcuts create some pretty powerful illusions and lead to some dangerous overconfidence. After that, we'll uncover the real reason we hate losing way more than we enjoy winning, and we'll meet the two different selves that are in charge of your life story. And finally, we'll pull it all together and figure out how we can start thinking a little smarter about how we think.
Okay, let's meet the main characters in your mental story. First, you've got the hero. Super fast, totally impulsive, always ready to jump into action. And then there's the sidekick. Really thoughtful, very powerful, but, well, he's unbelievably lazy. Kahneman calls them System 1 and System 2, and believe me, they are running your life.
So System 1 is your gut reaction. It is lightning fast, completely automatic, and it takes zero effort. It's the part of you that instantly knows a friend's face in a crowd or makes you flinch when a ball comes flying at your head. System 2 is the total opposite. It's your conscious, reasoning self. It's slow, deliberate, and it burns a ton of energy. That's the system you have to fire up to solve a math problem, compare two different products, or nail a tricky parallel part.
Just look at this problem on the screen. Now, don't try to solve it. Just notice what happens in your mind. An answer didn't just appear, did it? Nope. But you knew in a split second that you could solve it if you wanted to.
And that moment is the perfect example of how these two work together. Your fast System 1 instantly knew, hey, that's a multiplication problem. It even gave you a rough idea of the answer. You knew it wasn't going to be 5 or 50,000. But to get the actual answer, which is 408, by the way, you have to wake up your slow, lazy System 2. And this is the key to everything. System 2 would much rather do nothing. It lets System 1 run the show and only steps in when it absolutely has to.
Now, because using System 2 takes so much effort, our brain defaults to the much more efficient System 1 for pretty much our entire day. And to do this, it relies on a whole set of mental shortcuts. Now, these shortcuts are usually super helpful, but they also open us up to some really predictable mistakes and some very convincing illusions.
The official name for these shortcuts is heuristics. You can just think of them as mental rules of thumb. They're great for making quick decisions without having to think too hard, but they're also the root cause of many of the biases we're about to get into.
Okay, take a look at this image. A simple question. Are the two figures the same size on the page? Your intuitive System 1 is probably screaming, no way. The guy on the back is obviously bigger. But if you were to take out a ruler and measure them, you'd find they are identical. So what just happened? It's a classic mental trick. Your brain substituted the hard question, judging 2D size, for an easier one. Which man is bigger in this 3D room? It used all those perspective cues to build a quick story, and that story gave you the wrong answer to the question you were actually asked.
This kind of thing happens in our relationships all the time, thanks to something called the availability heuristic. All that means is that we judge how common something is based on how easily examples pop into our heads. For instance, when you ask spouses what percentage of the housework they do, the total almost always adds up to way more than 100%. And it's not because they're lying, it's just that all the chores they did are way more available in their memory than the ones their partner did.
And this availability heuristic completely messes up our sense of risk, too. We tend to worry way more about dramatic, headline-grabbing events like accidents or plane crashes, but we underestimate the less exciting, but much more common, killers like strokes or diabetes. Because a shark attack is easier to remember than a death from asthma, our judgment about how often these things happen gets totally warped.
So these shortcuts lead us to one of the biggest biases of them all, overconfidence. You see, System 1 is a fantastic storyteller. It can take any little bit of information it has and quickly weave it into a coherent story. The problem is, it never stops to ask the most important question: what information am I missing here?
This quote really gets to the heart of a principle Kahneman calls YWSIT, which is short for what you see is all there is. Your System 1 just takes whatever facts are right in front of you and builds the best story it can. But here's the crazy part. The less information you have, the easier it is to create a simple, neat story. And this makes us feel dangerously confident in judgments that are based on really incomplete evidence.
Biasiati is exactly why we have the planning fallacy. That's our tendency to be wildly optimistic about how long a project will take or how much it'll cost. Kahneman even fell for it himself. He was part of a team designing a new curriculum, and they all confidently estimated it would take about 2 years. You know how long it actually took? 8 years. They were only focused on their own plan, what he calls the inside view, and they completely ignored the outside view, which was the simple fact that most projects like theirs take way longer, if they even get finished at all. Let's make this really concrete. Back in 2002, a survey asked homeowners how much they thought a kitchen remodel would cost. The average answer was about $18,500. Sounds pretty reasonable, right? That's their inside view.
But the reality, the outside view from what actually happened, was that the average real cost was nearly $39,000, more than double. That huge gap is the planning fallacy in action. And it's all fueled by our brain's tendency to just see the best-case scenario and ignore what the statistics are telling us.
Okay, so we know our minds are busy making up overconfident stories from incomplete information. But how does that affect the big decisions we make, especially when there's risk involved? Well, old-school economics used to think we were all rational calculators. But Kahneman's work showed we're driven by something way more emotional and powerful, the fear of losing.
And this is the core idea: loss aversion. For just about everyone, the psychological pain of losing $100 is way stronger than the pleasure of gaining $100. We are fundamentally wired to avoid losses more than we are to chase after equivalent gains. And this one simple fact explains a ton of irrational seeming behavior.
Take New York City cab drivers. From a purely economic standpoint, it makes total sense to work really long hours on rainy days when you can't find a cab and to just go home early on sunny days when business is slow. But a lot of drivers do the exact opposite. Why would they do that? Because they have a mental target for how much they want to make each day. On a slow day, they're losing against that target, so they'll work extra hours just to avoid the pain of that loss. But on a rainy day, they hit their target early. That's a gain, and they just don't feel much motivation to keep working. This brings us to what might be the most fascinating and profound idea in the entire book. If our feelings and choices are this complicated, then who exactly is the you that's experiencing it all? Kahneman says we actually have two different selves, one that lives life moment to moment and another one that tells the story about it later.
Let's break it down. Your experiencing self is the moviegoer. It lives completely in the present, just feeling whatever is happening right now. But your remembering self, that's the storyteller. It's the one that writes the review of the movie afterwards. And the remembering self is a terrible historian. It judges an entire experience based on just 2 moments, the most intense part, the peak, and how it ended. And what's crazy is, it almost totally ignores how long the experience actually was.
Think of it like this. You listen to an absolutely breathtaking 40-minute piece of music, but right at the very end, there's a loud, horrible screech from the record. Your remembering self will tell you the entire experience was ruined. But that's a cognitive illusion. Your experiencing self got 40 minutes of pure bliss, and you can't erase that. But it's the memory, the story with the bad ending, that sticks with you. And it's the remembering self that gets to make all your future choices.
So, where does that leave us? We've got a fast-acting but error-prone System 1 and a lazy but really capable System 2. We've got a remembering self that tells biased stories and calls all the shots. So, what are we supposed to do? Well, the point isn't that we're all hopelessly irrational. It's that we can learn to recognize the situations where our brains are most likely to lead us astray.
We can learn to just slow down, to wake up that lazy System 2, and to actively go looking for that outside view before we jump to a conclusion. The goal is not to get rid of your intuition, but to know when to trust it and when to question it. So now that you've met the impulsive hero and the biased storyteller that live in your head, the real question is, who are you going to let write the next chapter of your story?